camera turned on. And indeed, you will all have got the little recording in process message there. So yeah, I'm going to be starting off tonight talking about VPAS and just explaining a bit about what it is and what we're talking about. So as everyone on this call I know will be very well aware, the NHS is in a national crisis at the moment. Oh, I just lost you all. There we go. Let me just get you back again. Right. Yeah, the NHS is in a national crisis at the moment. So there are a record-breaking 7.2 million people on waiting lists for treatment. And I calculated what percentage of the UK population this was earlier. This is a shocking 10% of the UK population. Hundreds of patients are dying each week before they can get the care that they need. And burnt out and underpaid staff are leaving the health service in their droves. Just treatment, every day we see the impacts of this crisis. We have people contacting us because they are being forced to go private because they can't wait any longer for treatment. We have had people who have lost loved ones waiting for ambulances to arrive. And we're hearing from staff like Carol who are both exhausted and brokenhearted because they cannot provide the care that they want to provide for people. Our NHS is truly on the brink of collapse, and there is a very real threat now that we're going to end up with a two-tier system, much like in the US, where those who can afford it can pay for decent healthcare, and those who cannot are left without. So now is really the time that the NHS needs to be priority number one, and yet it is at this precise moment that Big Pharma is demanding that the NHS pay approximately 2.5 billion more per year for medicines. This is a figure which could destroy our already broken NHS. So tonight we're going to be talking about how they're demanding this figure and crucially what we can do to stop Big Pharma getting their way. So another acronym, the Association for the British Pharmaceutical Industry, or the ABPI, which essentially represents the pharmaceutical industry in the UK. They are pushing very hard at the moment to overturn VPAS. And VPAS, although very technical in name and quite jargony, it's actually a really, really crucial agreement, which quite simply is there to keep the greed of Big Pharma in check and to make sure that it doesn't completely cripple our NHS. So versions of VPAS are nothing new. There have been schemes like VPAS, like caps on the amount that can be spent on branded medicine since 1978. So that was when the first cap was negotiated. It was called the Pharmaceutical Price Regulation Scheme. And for the last 4 decades, the schemes have had different names and have looked slightly different, but they have all essentially acted as a check to curb the extortionate sums that pharma charge for their medicines. And really what these schemes have done is allowed patients to access the most important medicines at a cost that the NHS can afford. Yet after 40 years of this kind of balance and check and agreement between the NHS and Big Pharma, the pharmaceutical industry now want to rip it up the rulebook and to take even more money from our health system, even if they destroy it in the process. If we could go to the next slide, please, Hope. So the current VPAS agreement will run for 5 years. It will run from January 2019 to the end of 2023. And it basically agrees that NHS expenditure on branded medicine stays within an agreed limit. And this limit will rise by 2% every year. So 2% every year it should be 2018 to 2023. And in order to achieve this, pharmaceutical companies essentially pay a rebate on their sales back to the NHS on all expenditure over this capped limit. So this rebate, this money that pharmaceutical companies pay back to the NHS, means that other vital parts of the NHS have the funding that they need, and that the pharmaceutical industry, which is a very rich industry, and the kind of rich pharma execs and their shareholders don't get such an excessive amount of money. You know, they're still making plenty of profits. Onto the next slide. So over the past 5 years, with the current VPAS scheme, the NHS has been able to recover 7 billion of excess pharma profits. So we're not talking about a tiny bit of money. We're not talking about a bit of money that can make a little difference here and there. 7 billion is enough money to build 14 new hospitals. We're talking about a major chunk of NHS money that can be spent on vital infrastructure, that can be spent on wages, that really is important to the NHS's function. So VPAS really is protecting a very large chunk of money. On to the next slide. And the pharmaceutical industry, in the run-up to these negotiations, has been complaining, kind of asking us to get out our tiny violins for it, and complaining that it isn't making enough money, and that it's suffering through the VPAS scheme. But if you'll excuse my English, this is absolute bullshit. The pharmaceutical industry is one of the most profitable businesses in the world. And there's been a bunch of research recently done by folks at LSE, the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and the University of York, which has shown that even with VPAS in place, the total cost of prescription medicines to the NHS in England reached a new high of 17.2 billion in the financial year 2021 to 2022. So really, we're still talking about eye-watering sums going from our health service to the pharmaceutical industry. On to the next slide. And the same LSE report outlines how the increased cost comes, in fact, a lot of it comes from a very small number of extortionately priced medicines. So, for example, for respiratory system disorders, the top 3 products alone contributed an additional 561 million in spending between 2018 and 2022. For malignant diseases and immunosuppression, the top 3 products accounted for 333 million. So just for these 6 drugs alone, you're looking at an extra 894 million. So really, some drugs are just having extortionate amounts of money charged for them. And this really shows how drug companies are ramping up prices on particular medicines where they know they can really make a profit to squeeze as much money from the NHS. And it's these kind of excessive profiteering that VPAS is so important in curbing. On to the next slide. So according to research by the British Medical Journal, even if companies in the pharmaceutical industry lost 1/5 of their profits, they would still outperform 75% of other sectors. So really what all of these figures are showing is just how well the pharmaceutical industry are doing. And although you may read that they're saying, that VPAS needs to be renegotiated, this is absolutely not the case. It is our NHS that needs a strong VPAS agreement. On to the next slide, please. So as the VPAS agreement runs out at the end of 2023, it is being renegotiated at the moment. And this means that the government and the British pharmaceutical industry will be in negotiations throughout the summer and the early autumn. And we really need to keep the pressure on the government to concede as little as possible to the pharmaceutical industry. If VPAS was scrapped, it's estimated that every year, 2.5 billion extra of the NHS budget would be going into the pockets of Big Pharma instead of funding our health service. And to put this into perspective, 2.5 billion is enough to fund a full pay restoration for the NHS junior doctors in England 2.5 times over. So really, this is money that we absolutely have to keep in our health service. On to the next slide, please. So it's clear that Big Pharma are playing really dirty in these negotiations. They are essentially trying to hold us to ransom by threatening to cut the supply of medicines to the UK and leaving to invest in other countries if the rebate scheme continues. Yet the authors of the LSE report argue that the UK is too reliable a market for the pharmaceutical industry to actually pull medicines. They assessed the different pricing levels for drugs, taking into account their impact on current and future health, and concluded that even with VPAS in place, medicine prices in the UK are too high in comparison with other countries. So essentially, pharma are already getting a really good deal in the UK. We can't give in to this blackmail. The government must completely reject Big Pharma's demand to cut the VPAS rebate simply to boost their profits. Instead, the government should invest in publicly funded research that will mean better jobs for UK citizens and better medicines for NHS patients. And then on to the next slide, please. So VPAS was designed to ensure that the NHS medicines bill does not spiral out of control and to place restraint on excess profits that the industry reaps from the NHS. The rebate must stay in place, or Big Pharma could ring the death bell for the NHS, the death knell for the NHS as we know it. So I know that that was quite a lot of information with quite a lot of stats and figures quite quickly. And there will be plenty of time for questions at the end. So if you do have things you're wondering about now, stuff you'd like to dig into a bit more, or simply ask us to repeat or expand on a bit, please stick your question into the chat. And we do our best to get to them at the end. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Carol. Carol is a nurse and an amazing Just Treatment patient leader. For those of you who've been on our webinars before, you may recognise her because Carol always speaks so powerfully and is incredibly generous with her time in giving us her insights. So yeah, Carol's going to give us a bit more information about what it's like actually caring for patients in the NHS at the moment, and what draining even more money from our NHS system could mean for patients. So yeah, thanks, Carol. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you for this opportunity. And as Emma said, I'm a nurse. I'm about to work my last shift on Friday. So what I'd like to do is talk about my experience in the NHS, in the private sector, and in primary care. So if I go first to my experience in the independent sector in a mental health setting, here you have mentally ill patients who are very vulnerable. Their illness is severe and enduring. So they are absolutely in need of their medication. Because of Brexit, many medications that they require, we have not been able to get for them. So in many cases, many of our patients have had to have another drug or something similar to what they used to have, but not necessarily what they should have. And this is very, very difficult because some patients with a minute change in their medication, they know that it's not doing what it should be doing for them because they're so reliant on what has been prescribed for them. And that has been a real difficulty because you talk to the pharmacy, you say, well, this isn't quite what the doctor prescribed. Yes, but it is similar. And you think, well, you know, I'm a nurse and I'm supposed to give what has been prescribed. and you're saying I should give this, when the patient's saying I usually have a pink one and I'm having to give them a purple one. And of course, the patient's not happy. And I'm not happy because the patient thinks I'm giving them the wrong medication. And yet I'm having to do that. So I feel very dissatisfied. The patient's not very happy because they don't feel they're getting the medication they require. And when the doctor has a review with them, they're saying the nurses are not giving the medication that you want me to have, doctor. So what do you say in that situation? It's very, very, very difficult. Going back to the NHS, working as a mental health nurse in a mental health unit that takes patients away from a very busy accident and emergency department, I can tell you that I have been an accident and emergency nurse. And one of the things that I tell my asthmatic patients is, if you cannot have a conversation with someone because you're so breathless and you need your blue inhaler, which is the inhaler you take for emergency, ring for an ambulance and get into hospital and get a nebulizer, which will help relieve them and help enable them to breathe. Many patients have, I'm told, and as a general practice nurse, and we'll go on to that in a minute, as a general practice nurse, I get all the accident emergency slips of patients that go to A&E so that I can follow them up and I can ensure that they're all right and they've gone home and their treatment is continued and is successful and all right. Patients will tell me that they were discharged from A&E. They didn't stay in A&E overnight because there were no beds. They will tell me that A&E didn't have an inhaler for them in an emergency situation. So they didn't go home with a blue inhaler that they needed, that they didn't have. I find that very difficult. An accident emergency service cannot provide an intervention such as an inhaler to enable patients to breathe. I find that astonishing, astonishing. So going back to my mental health unit, I take mental health patients away from A&E into a quieter unit where patients are able to eat because they've often not eaten for many days. They haven't slept for many days, and that has increased their mental ill health and their vulnerabilities. I was in a situation where none of my patients could have a basic sleeping tablet, one that wouldn't mask their mental illness so that we can assess the patient, but one that would help calm them down a bit and help them to at least get some relief from their psychosis. I find that really hard. I went to the pharmacy and I said, you know, here's my order. I'd like this for my patients. I need them to sleep. They've not been sleeping for about a week. They really need to calm down. I don't want to give them an injection. I'd rather them have medication so that I can assess them and do all the things that I need to do to be a good nurse, which I am. I need to be able to do my job well. And they said, sorry, we've not had this for a year. What do you mean not had them for a year? Well, you might have more luck, they said. This is a hospital pharmacy, if you go to Boots. So of course, in my break, which I don't often take, but I decided I'd go and try my luck at Boots. And they said they haven't had this medication for ages. And I just could not believe it. And before I even went to Boots, in the hospital itself, I went to a medical ward. I went to several medical wards in the hospital. And then I thought, well, I can try my luck with the surgical wards. And they didn't have the medication either. And I thought, this is astonishing. I'm in a hospital. I have a hospital pharmacy, and I still can't get the drugs. I've gone to Boots and I still can't get the drugs. One of my patients said to me, well, actually, I've got some at home. So if you ring my brother can get the keys off me and go to my flat, go in the house and get me the pills that I need to sleep. And that's how I got round it. How can this be happening in this century, in this time? I am a diabetic patient, so I go and collect my medication. In fact, I went today, and I see patients looking at the list of medication that they're to have, and they're thinking, I can't afford this. And they are picking and choosing what they will take and what they will take away for their health and their well-being. This is not good. This is really heart-rending, sad, really, really, really sad. And it breaks my heart. Last Friday, I'm a general practice nurse. I work as a general practice nurse in a surgery. And most of my job, a great part of my job, is doing immunizations for children. And we have a relentless immunization program, which I'm very proud of, because we have stopped many childhood illnesses coming, although measles is coming back, and we really need to stamp that out. And this holiday, we'll be giving a lot of children, updating them and do catch-ups to make sure they get their measles jab. But I gave a mother their child, their 3-year-old child, immunization. And I said to Mum, you know, part of the immunization thing is that the child will have a temperature. So just give her some Calpol every 4 hours. And the mum said, Calpol? I said, yeah, paracetamol, that's Calpol. And I know she knew that because the child had had many immunizations before that, up to the age of the age they were when I was seeing them. And she just burst out in tears, crying. And I said, oh, sorry, you know, I didn't know what I'd said to make her react so strongly. And she said, I can't afford Calpol. And I just could not believe it. I could not believe it. And so I looked in all the cupboards, because sometimes we used to have, in the good old days, I don't know if any of you remember going to the doctors and having having an injection or something done to you, and the nurse was able to give you some Calpol to get the temperature down. We used to have it. We used to give it. The pharmaceutical companies used to give us sachets of Calpol that we used to give mothers when they had certain medication like meningitis B, which is notorious for making babies have temperatures. We don't have them anymore. It's not given anymore. Nothing's given anymore. And this mother burst into tears. She couldn't afford it. I'm not allowed to write a prescription for Calpol. I'm not allowed to write a prescription for a Ventolin inhaler, because we have to reduce the cost that is in primary care as well as secondary care. So a lot of things that we would give our patients to ensure that they keep well, that they have an inhaler at school or at work, wherever, I am not allowed. I have to bring the medication bill down by not prescribing anything as additional. So what was I to say to that mum? I said, okay, then just tepid sponging, which is, you know, getting a funnel with coolish water on the brow, and just keep the temperature down when the temperature goes up. If it doesn't go down, then ring for an ambulance, take your child to hospital. And I felt really bad, because what else could I tell the mum? I had no Calpol to give her. I wasn't allowed to prescribe it because I have to keep the bill down. So every day that I work, I am frustrated, because my patients who are asthmatic, ADHD, if you have a child or an adult who's got that diagnosis or on the autistic spectrum, all these drugs are so expensive. And when you can't get them because the cost is hiked up so much, it is very, very worrying and frustrating for me as a nurse, frustrating as GPs. We're all working under such tight restrictions that we feel we're not able to do our jobs. And as a result of that, 64,000 nurses have already left nursing. I am leaving on Friday. We're on our knees. We cannot provide the care, the quality care that we need to give. Even analgesia, painkillers, paracetamol, depending where you get it, you can pay 35 pence, 19 pence, so many variations on it. But if you have chronic pain, it's almost like a bottle of milk. You have to find the money to buy it yourself. And it's getting more and more expensive. You can't buy more than 2 boxes. So as soon as you buy them, you have to be buying them again. And you can't get a prescription that is going to cover you long enough. So you're forever running out. You're forever in pain. So nothing is maintained or controlled or whatever. And as nurses, my job is to do no harm. And I feel if your prescription runs out and I can't help you to even the pharmacist can't help you, because it seems to be that they save a bit of money if they don't quite give you enough to cover 2 months' supply. I just, it's astonishing. It really is. So we really must fight this cause. And I don't understand it, because it's so easy to give nurses enough money that they can survive, stay, be retained, and recruit more nurses, as with the junior doctors, as with everybody else in the NHS, to make it safe practice. At the moment, there's not enough nurses on duty in nursing homes. The qualified nurse, she's not there to do caring. All she is someone that gives the drugs. She starts early morning shift by taking the handover, and she moves around with the trolley and she gives out the medication for patients. And then before you know it, she's doing it again for lunchtime. And then before she goes off duty, she's doing it again, because there's not enough other qualified nurses. There's only one nurse on the floor, and they're just doing medication when they really want to be with the patient, to be there to talk to them, to be compassionate, to do all the things that we need to do, rather than just being there to give out medication, which half of them are not on the trolley, as it were.
Thanks so much, Carol. I'm going to have to move on to James just to make
That's all right. Yes.
We get enough time for questions, but as ever, when you speak, I learn so much. I mean, that's absolutely shocking what you're saying about sleeping pills and people not having inhalers, and just, I mean, heartbreaking. Thank you so much. I'm going to move on to James, Advocacy Manager at STOPAIDS now, and an access to medicines expert. James is going to take a slightly wider lens, and yeah, just talk a bit about how much money pharma are making off medicines that they sell to the NHS, and also outlining some of the ways that we might be able to do medicine differently. So hand over to James now.
Thanks so much. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. Oh, well, what a privilege it is to join and speak after your really powerful testimony, Carol, really highlighting what we need to do to save the future for NHS and guarantee the right to health for everyone. So as Emma was eloquently highlighting, we absolutely must need to stop big pharma's profiteering over VPAS, but good to think through what the new model for research and development could be and what we should be fighting for too. So in the next 10 minutes or so, I'm going to outline some of the wider issues within our failing R&D system, and outline how it can be improved. So it could be a few slides, if you're okay to share the first slide. So as Emma was highlighting, a big issue we're facing right now is the affordability of drugs and how this is now an issue that affects all countries' health system. So key reason for this is big pharma's protection over the intellectual property. So patents block competition, which essentially allows companies to charge the highest price possible that the market can bear. And then what we're seeing right now and what in recent campaigning that Just Treatment have led on regarding kind of access to cystic fibrosis drugs and other drugs too. This allows big pharma companies to hold the NHS essentially to ransom, denying or delaying patients to essential drugs. And this really is truly a global issue. If the UK, as one of the leading economies worldwide, having issues with facing drugs, just imagine what it would be for many lower income countries. Often even basic drugs are simply unaffordable for many countries' health systems, and this has the biggest impact on marginalized communities. So for example, every year, roughly 100 million people are pushed into poverty or have to pay out of pocket for high drug prices. And as Emma was saying, the cost of drugs have gone up a lot in recent years as well too, as LSE reports highlights as well. If you mind going to the next slide, please. Hope this also highlights, despite what big pharma's lies often peddle and the myths they peddle, the system for research and developing drugs is actually very inefficient. Often drugs that come into market offer little additional health benefits, are more tailored to where big pharma company could extract the biggest possible profit, whilst other urgent public health needs, such as new antibiotics and diseases that affect people living in poverty, generally like tuberculosis, are essentially ignored by the profit-driven R&D system simply because they're not profitable enough for the market. There's also a systemic lack of transparency in the whole research and development system, so ranging from no transparency largely in R&D costs, very little transparency on the pricing of medicines, clinical trials, and lack of transparency on who actually does the funding to bring drugs to market, often hiding the crucial role that governments and taxpayers have in the innovation process as well. And the final point, there being largely a lack of public return on public investment. So globally, it's estimated that the public pays for 2/3 of all upfront drug R&D costs, not the private sector, and roughly 1/3 of all new medicines originate from a public research institution. And sorry, research and development, R&D stands for research and development, or biomedical products. So in terms of the point of a lack of public return on public investment, this has most recently been shown with the COVID response. Governments spent the vast majority in the research and development costs for new vaccines and other tools to prevent COVID, but then essentially were given a big blank, pharma companies were given a big blank check by governments, which allowed them to have sole control of the intellectual property, deciding who to sell for, and crucially, what price to sell for as well, which unfortunately left out many countries in the developing world from getting access to vaccines too. So I wanted to give one recent case study of this, if you're okay to move on to the next slide. And this comes from a joint report that STOPAIDS, Global Justice Now, and Just Treatment published only a few weeks ago, called Bitter Pills, Why the NHS Can't Swallow Big Pharma's Profiteering. So our research recently has highlighted that the NHS spent an eye-watering 13 billion on just 10 medicines in the 10 years up to 2022. And based on the information that we have on drug pricing and the cost of production for these drugs, we've estimated that NHS could have saved approximately 12 billion over the last 10 years if we were able to pay the real cost of manufacturing these medicines. 12 billion. And we've just to go back, to Emma's earlier points on what the VPAS savings could have made in terms of hospitals, this money would have been a significant boost for the NHS, particularly in a time of the cost of living crisis and the cuts the NHS service is currently facing as well. And as we've discussed earlier in the call, big drug companies often claim the high prices are justified because of the significant cost in investing and creating these new drugs. But from our analysis in the report, we find that for all of these 10 drugs, all of them had benefited by work from scientists in public institutions, from the public funding, from charitable funding, or in some cases, a mixture of all three. We assess that very few of these drugs could reasonably be said to have to be fully invented from the companies that now market them alone. So I saw a question in the chat around the list of the full 10 drugs. I'll share a link to this shortly, but just one of the drugs highlighted in the paper is the anti-inflammatory drug adalimumab, which cost the NHS over 2.7 billion over the past 10 years, which gave the big pharma company AbbVie over 208 billion pounds, $1 billion, sorry, in global sales to date. But for AbbVie, they didn't actually invent the drugs. It instead acquired the know-how and then was able to charge such an eye-watering price to the NHS and other countries' health system as well. But as Emma was highlighting at the start of the call, if the situation could have been a lot worse if we didn't have schemes like VPAS there, which big pharma companies are trying to actively weaken at the moment as well. So with our research highlighting the massively fundamental role that the public sector plays in the development of new medicines, we think it's by time now for all governments, including the UK, to do more to stand up for our rights and build a pharmaceutical companies that prioritizes patients and prioritizes a fair and balanced research and development system over excessive profits for the private sector. So how could we do that? If you could move on to the next slides, I'm going to, for the next few minutes, outline a few different solutions that we think could help deliver better prices for the NHS, a better return on the research and development costs spent by the state on medical production, and the better sharing of know-how and knowledge to create a more innovative and fair collaborative system that delivers better medicines for all. So the first solution I wanted to highlight is firstly to ensure stricter conditions on public funding. So we think it is vital if the government rightly is going to be a leading funder in supporting the research and development of all drugs. The government should insist that this funding comes with strict conditions to safeguard national and global affordability and promote open science research. So if we were able to enforce these conditions in contracts as a right to receive funding, this will help ensure the sharing of technology, will help deliver transparency, and also make value for money a central component of our right to. And from this also feeds into how we can better control intellectual property as well. If you can move to the next slide. So we think intellectual property or IP should be managed to maximize public goods. Increasingly, there's more and more research that says stricter, rigid IP rights are actually a poor way of rewarding innovation, particularly when we're not seeing innovation in neglected areas like antibiotics or for diseases of poverty like TB. So there's new research suggesting more innovative ways that we could do research. So for example, innovation could be rewarded in alternative ways like prize giving or grant funding to help avoid monopoly control over knowledge and manufacturing. So if we were to remove a big pharma company's monopoly control over a drug, this would help correct market failure, stimulate new innovation in areas like antibiotics, and also guarantee affordability and access for all, as it would no longer have sole IP rights, and as they've been rewarded for the funding through grant funding instead. And in the short term, as I think someone commented on earlier in the meeting, we think the government, like India and many other countries are doing as well, should use other legal flexibilities to get access to drugs. So one of these crucial tools includes compulsory licensing, where a government could remove the sole IP rights of a pharma company to help ensure access to a particular drug or medical technology too. The next solution I wanted to highlight briefly is to build public infrastructure for medicine production. So whilst we're seeing such clear failures in the private sector, we must be looking to rebuild public infrastructure. So I think, as we highlighted earlier, the growth inequity in COVID-19 vaccines and tools showed us the issues with being reliant on a very small number of small companies to how they produce the capacity to produce medicines for the whole world. So we think it's now urgent that the UK government works to build domestic manufacturing capacity for all drugs, including establishing public manufacturing centres where needed. And as some of our pool reports have put out in the past, given the failures of the big pharma system and the need to ensure access to medicines, the government should also explore democratically owned pharmaceutical companies with specific missions to serve the needs of the NHS. A penultimate point I wanted to highlight was using better safeguards to control the powers of big pharma and ensure a more balanced pharmaceutical sector. So the biggest players in the big pharma sector are often protected from competition, from mergers and acquisitions, and they've become key of a way for their growth within the sector. So we think the UK government should have a more strategic application of competition law, which will help create a more balanced sector and also incentivize innovation within smaller companies, and which will then help to hopefully lead to lower prices through generic competition. And the final point I wanted to briefly highlight again is how in this next few months, when the government is going to be negotiating on the VPAS scheme. If you could move to the next slide, please. Hope is to reject the VPAS proposals from the big pharma lobby and ensure better safeguarding on public funding. So I haven't had a huge amount of time for this presentation, so apologies for rushing through a few of these points, and happy to pick up a few of your questions in the chat and comments or through discussion if time allows, but I did want to highlight a few further resources if people would want to read more or to get more involved. So firstly is the joint report from Just Treatment, STOPAIDS and Global Justice Now, the People's Prescription, which outlines a new visionary approach to how to deal with the issues within the big pharma-driven research development system and deliver a new model based on supporting innovation and supporting patients. The next one is also Just Treatment and STOPAIDS' joint series, Access Denied, which highlights the failures during the COVID-19 pandemic and how we can use the pandemic to build a new health innovation model. And finally, the Bitter Pills report that I just referenced that looks at the top 10 most expensive drugs for the NHS and highlights what we can do now to prevent further big pharma price gouging on the NHS. Thank you very much, everyone, for your engagement and the questions so far during the meeting.
Thanks, James. That was a really great overview. You made that look simple, but it wasn't. So now we're going to go to some questions. We don't have loads of time. We've had some good ones in though. So first of all, I noticed a question just in relation to what you were saying, James, which I thought was a really good one. Could you unpack the notion of a democratically controlled company, please? Don't know if you'd be able to say a bit more about that, James.
Yeah, very happy to. So what we've been discussing a bit and seen over in recent years within access to medicine space within the UK is for how for some drugs, be that for cancer drugs or be that for drugs for cystic fibrosis, often big pharma companies, when they had sole control over intellectual property rights, have been demanding increasingly expensive prices for these products. And often, as I was saying, there's often shortages in some treatments like antibiotics or the pharmaceuticals that have been faced at NHS in recent years as well. So one way of addressing some of these bottlenecks, but also supporting efforts for compulsory licensing and ensuring that we have the robust ability to produce vaccines in times of emergency, like learning from the COVID-19 pandemic, could be exploring having a series or one nationalized pharmaceutical company that could produce medicines and vaccines for the NHS and other health systems as well. So this was something that we go into more detail on within our people subscription reports that we link to, and something that we think that the government should urgently be thinking about right now, particularly given how we are often doing so much of the research development and paying for the innovation. So to go one step forward to think through what we can do to both in pandemic and non-pandemic times to guarantee that all patients have access to products, and also we're not held under ransom by big pharma companies price gouging.
Thanks, James. And then the next question I wanted to come to was from Francis. Other countries such as India are demanding to be allowed to produce generic drugs. Why can we not do the same? So I'd like to use this briefly because there was an example in the UK where there was a call to use a Crown use license to get access to some drugs called modulators to treat cystic fibrosis. And this came from a group of patients that Just Treatment were working with. There's a miracle drug for cystic fibrosis that changes it from a condition that you'll likely die of in your early 20s to a chronic condition that you can manage. But the company that make it charge an absolutely extortionate price. The NHS said they could not afford it. So Just Treatment worked with a group of patients, mostly parents of kids with cystic fibrosis, and called for a Crown use license, the kind of UK equivalent of a compulsory license, which is when there is a license for a generic company to make a drug at a much cheaper price, because and there's particular conditions when you can use this when a company is abusing its patent. It was a very successful campaign, and it meant that the drug company dropped their price and the NHS were able to afford it. And now there are compulsory license challenges against Vertex to try and get access to this drug in many countries across the world: South Africa, Ukraine, Brazil, and indeed India, where the patients there have a really, really strong campaign. And hopefully Vertex will be forced to drop their prices across the world. So yeah, calling for generics, calling for compulsory licenses is a really successful tactic to get individual prices dropped, and it is a tactic that can be used sometimes in the UK and are used in other countries as well, and is something that we would argue should be used even more. But the thing with the compulsory license is it has to go drug by drug. And what a scheme like a VPAS does is across the board says you cannot spend more than this amount. So really we need all of these different mechanisms to try and keep the pharmaceutical industry in check. And so we are running out of time now. So I'm going to go to the final question, which was, what do you recommend that we as individuals do? Because that leads us very nicely onto the end of the call here. So we do have something which we would like you as individuals to do. So the VPAS negotiations are going to run through until about October, November, when a deal will have to be finalised. So the final deal can be implemented at the start of January 2024. So we're going to be working with our partners at STOPAIDS and at Global Justice Now to really try and ramp up the pressure throughout the summer and the autumn. So far, the government are holding a reasonably strong line against the pharmaceutical industry, at least in their rhetoric. So we really need to show the government that this is an issue that could win or lose them votes at the election next year, and one that constituents really care about. So what we're asking you all to do is to write to your own MP to raise the VPAS negotiations with their relevant health spokesperson. So if you've got a Tory MP, that would mean writing to the Health Secretary. If you've got a Labour MP, that would mean writing to the Shadow Health Secretary. So we're getting MPs to raise it directly with the health representatives. And we need to ensure that the Health Secretary really feels the heat on the issue. And we also need to ensure that the opposition parties are doing their bit to hold the government to account. And that's why we think getting MPs to raise it with their health representatives directly will be the most effective way of doing that. It is the summer, of course, and MPs are on recess, so it may take a bit longer for them to get back to you, but we think it's really important to start raising the issue now, and then we can ramp up the pressure during the autumn. So tomorrow we're going to be sending out a letter writing action. Look out for it tomorrow afternoon. And once you've done the action, if you can think of a couple of friends to send it on to, you can tell them that you were on this call, explain why it's such an important issue and ask them to take the action as well. That would be amazing. There'll be a template for the letter that you can write to your MP. You can tweak it a little bit if you want, but it'll be a really, really easy action to do, and it won't take you very long. If you're not already on Just Treatment's mailing list, then please do sign up to that tonight and you'll get the action tomorrow. I think Hope should be putting the link in the chat right now. Thank you, Hope. So yeah, look out for the action tomorrow afternoon. If you can do that, that would be brilliant. And we can start ramping up the pressure. And yeah, look out for more of what we're doing to keep the pressure on throughout the autumn. So yeah, thanks for joining, everyone. I know it's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour through a lot of different information. It's really been great having all of you on the call, like really engaged questions. I really appreciate it, quite late on a Monday evening. So yeah, if you want to find out more about Just Treatment's webinars, you know, we have them on a variety of issues around the NHS and Big Pharma. Do sign up to Just Treatment's mailing list. We tend to have calls like this about once every 2 months. And plus you'll find out about other campaign actions and events around VPAS. So yeah, I'd just like to end by thanking our wonderful speakers, Carol and James. Yeah, you both brought a lot of information really succinctly, and thanks for that. And yeah, the dot of 9 o'clock, not before, but at least on the dot. Yeah, I'll say goodnight now and then leave you to enjoy the rest of your evenings. Thanks, everyone.